Biggest news about trade is, first of all, within China itself, is going to try to jumpstart its economy by injecting over 500 billion US dollars of stimulus into its economy. Right now, the supply equation is starting to be restored in China as factories and the industrial base starts to revive itself. But the big question is, where is the demand coming from? And COVID-19 has certainly crimped demand worldwide. And so not only are there questions as to whether or not there will be demand recovery in China, with the Chinese consumers largely holding onto their pocketbooks, but as well as in the United States and the EU. So this most recent political conference certainly does offer some hope that the Chinese economy is going to start to engage in some degree of revival, but I think it's much less ambitious than what we've heard from the leaders in the past.
Now, we also did see some companies move their supply chains out of China once the pandemic began. Talk about the reasoning behind that and whether it could be a temporary versus longer-term strategy.
I'm afraid to say that I think it's going to be a longer-term impact. Many of the companies that are starting to leave China and allocate their supply chains to countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, and other parts of the world, they're largely doing it for, A, cost reasons, because the cost of labor has, of course, have risen quite dramatically in China, and secondarily, this requirement that they need to reflect on the hardness and the resilience of their supply chains. So this global disruption initiated by COVID-19 is having many corporations do a rethink about their global supply chains and try to build some resiliency into those supply chains by diversifying those supply base. So I believe this is part of a longer-term initiative that you will see, certainly impacting the Chinese economy.
So then, given what we're seeing now with tensions between Washington and Beijing, what can China really do to shore up its supply chain resiliency?
Well, some of the things, they're going to have to maybe take a look at other types of industries. I know that with regard to China's 2025 initiative to try to go upscale in terms of elevating the supply chain and developing higher degrees of technological content within those supply chains itself. They're also looking again at also maybe restoring some degree of infrastructure and capital investment-led growth within the Chinese economy with major initiatives in terms of investment in 5G, as well as autonomous cars and electric cars.
Now, we have seen that there have been several reports, including from Reuters, claiming that the U.S. is turbocharging an initiative to remove global industrial supply chains from China. Is that a possibility, and how might that happen?
I would say yes and no. To a certain extent, for certain types of industries and certain types of manufactured products, there are really not that many alternatives, simply because of the broad variety of, let's say, supply infrastructure that already resides within China. There are not a lot of countries that have this degree of robustness in terms of the availability of parts and various types of services and supplies. But on the other hand, I think you're going to see within the halls of Congress bipartisan legislation being pushed through that will require certain industries, particularly the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry in the United States, to have a certain amount of domestic content, just as they have imposed on Japanese automotive manufacturers in the United States. You can see that domestic content regulations are going to be imposed on American companies, requiring them to source a certain amount or a majority of their products from USA-based companies.
So just quickly, we have about 30 seconds then. Given what you're seeing then, what does this mean for China's trade outlook going forward this year?
I think the trade outlook is going to be dimmed. I think for China itself, they're going to have to reevaluate those components of GDP growth. And ultimately, it's really going to be more reliant internally in terms of looking at that 1.3 billion population. How can our own consumers and this large population base be the source of demand that will fuel our economy in the years ahead? So for this year, I don't think China has very great expectations in terms of what the export picture is going to be, simply because demand is just not there. But moving forward, I think China is going to resort to unleashing the power of its 1 billion plus population as the major driver of its domestic economy.
All right, Arthur Dong there.